Welcome, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar on road attacks and their impact on humanitarian operations. I'm Anna Carey, Solutions Manager with DisasterReady.org. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Attendees are on mute to reduce background noises, but please do double check to be sure either your phone or computer speakers are on mute now. You can check that by looking in the participants panel on the right-hand side of your screen and clicking the mute button to silence your microphone, and that'll help us all be able to hear just a bit better. If you have any questions at any point during the presentation, please feel free to submit your questions to all panelists via the chat window. We will address your questions during the Q&A portion of the webinar. Please also join us on Twitter and share any questions or comments at #DisasterReady or @DisasterReady. Finally, today's recording, as well as a copy of all of the slides, will be posted on DisasterReady.org in 48 hours. Now I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, George Devendorf, Senior Advisor to DisasterReady.org. George?
Anna, thank you very much, and good day to everyone. Thank you all for joining us. Before we get started, I'd just like to say a brief word about DisasterReady.org, which is co-hosting today's webinar with the International NGO Safety and Security Association, or INSSA. DisasterReady is currently being used by more than 30,000 aid workers from over 180 countries around the world to improve their professional skills and prepare for the challenges they face in the field. A free online resource, DisasterReady has now been up and running for about 1.5 years and has drawn incredible support during that time from our list of partner agencies. I'd like to give them a quick shout out right now. On your screen, you should see a list of those agencies. So a big thanks to those agencies that you see now. Hey, I'm sorry, I think we have someone who is not muted joining us today, and apologies for that technical glitch. But if your mic is not currently muted, could you please do so now just to reduce the background noise? Thanks very much. So to continue, today's topic, unfortunately, is a very timely one. With current operations in and around places like Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sudan, roadside insecurity has never before been a bigger threat to humanitarian workers and their efforts in the field. We're really fortunate today to have with us two experts on this topic. I'll just say a quick word about both Adele and Michael, and then we'll jump right in. Adele Harmer of Humanitarian Outcomes has researched aid policy issues for over a decade. She's authored numerous publications on humanitarian policy issues, and she currently leads a 3-year research program on secure access in volatile environments designed to improve the evidence base on delivering aid in highly insecure contexts. One of her most recent publications, which she co-authored, is Unsafe Passage, Road Attacks, and Their Impact on Humanitarian Operations. Our other presenter today is Michael O'Neill. Michael serves as the Director of Global Safety and Security for Save the Children International. Prior to his current posting, he served as Senior Director for Global Safety and Security at Save the Children US for almost 10 years. Prior to taking up these positions with Save the Children, Michael also served as the coordinator of volunteer safety and overseas security at the Peace Corps. Michael has also been the vice chair, or served as the vice chair of the International NGO Safety and Security Association, INSSA, since 2011. So with those introductions, Adele, I'd like to hand off to you. So Adele, the floor is yours.
Adele, if you could check your microphone, we may have you on mute.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
We can. Welcome.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So thank you, George and Anna, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to have the opportunity to join everyone today to discuss this issue and to share the research that we've been doing on road security. As Anna noted, I'm a partner, or George noted, I'm a partner with Humanitarian Outcomes. It's a small independent research group that works on humanitarian policy and practice issues. And a major component of our research looks at operational security for civilian aid operations and the causes and effects of violence against aid workers. I'm going to skip to slide 2. Oh, thanks, Anna. There's a whole question, and I'm going to continue, and then we'll catch up with the slides. So what we do in particular is we track security incidents under a long-term project called the Aid Worker Security Database. So the acronym, which you may have heard, is AWSD. And this database tracks major incidents of violence, which include killings, kidnappings, and armed attack, which result in significant injury. And we've been tracking this. We have data that goes back to 1997. And as you'll see on your screen there, there's the website there. It's fully anonymized data, and it's available for public access. And you can look at the data by location, by tactic, by type of organization, by the type of personnel that are affected, and a range of other criteria. And we certainly welcome your feedback on that if you have any, and any questions you might have. Every year we also release a paper, a briefing paper to coincide with World Humanitarian Day, which is on the 19th of August. And that includes verified statistics from the previous year, and it also provides an opportunity for us to focus on a key issue which the data is bearing out. And so last year, because of a particular trend of kidnapping as a tactic of violence, we released a paper on kidnapping as a major issue. And then this year we focused on the security of road travel, which is going to be the primary focus of today's discussion. But before we look at it in detail, I just thought it might be good to give some of the broader picture analysis so that you can situate the significance of road travel and the challenges there against a range of other issues. So in this first slide, you'll see that over time, violence against aid workers has increased, both in absolute terms, and what you can see here is the raw numbers, the number of attacks and the number of victims. But it's also actually increased in relative terms, and by that I mean against the changing number of aid workers that are in the field at any given time. 2013 in particular saw a new record of violence against aid operations with 251 separate attacks affecting 460 aid workers. And of those aid workers, 155 were killed, 175 were wounded, and 134 were kidnapped. 87% of those are national staff, and 13% are international. So now I guess the question is, where is this happening? And is this a global trend, or is it something very specific to a small number of countries? From what we've looked at, it's not a universal phenomenon. The rise in attacks is only happening in a handful of extremely violent environments. In 2013, for example, there were 30 countries where incidents occurred, which were reported to the AWSD, but 3/4 of those incidents took place in just 5 settings. And as you can see there, that's Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, Pakistan, and Sudan. And if you actually control for these, what you could call extreme cases, violence affecting aid operations elsewhere is actually stable or even declining. So from an overall to the global data, we can conclude 2 things. First, that security risk management among humanitarian professionals is actually getting better overall. But by the same token, it's still not adequate to keep aid workers safe in the most hostile environments. So the next slide is looking at tactics. And this is essentially about the most prevalent types of major violence seen in the attacks. And this is important when we're trying to understand sort of particular areas of exposure or vulnerability of aid operations and personnel. For instance, the spike in kidnapping from 2012 became, as I said, the thematic focus of our 2013 report. And you'll see in this graph that it's shootings and kidnappings that may remain the most prevalent tactic, followed by bodily assault and explosives. And explosives is the smallest, but it did have a particular sort of upward trend from 2011 onwards. And of course, we track that particularly because it can do such significant damage. So you have a far greater fatality potentially. And then to the next slide, this is getting into the detail of what we're going to discuss today. We did two things to unpack a little bit more of the data. We look at the location, so whether we're looking at the victim was attacked in their home or at a project site or on the road. And that's what this graphic is telling you. But we also look at the attack context, which refers to sort of the broader tactical or situational frame in which the violence takes place. And since the AWSD first began tracking violent incidents, the clearest, in fact, and most consistent message that's come from our data is that most violence occurs in the context of an ambush or a roadside attack. And secondly, that aid workers are most vulnerable to attack when they're traveling on the road. So what you see in this graph is for 2013, and that is that 42.5% of incidents occurred while aid workers were traveling on the road. And then you'll see there's this sort of grey slice of the pie, which is undetermined. In other words, we just don't have enough information to determine the location. If we take that out and we just look at the incidents that we do have the information for, 56% of attacks happened on the road. A few more details in relation to road attacks. Of the 155 aid workers that were killed in 2012, about a third were killed in road attacks. And if we take the cumulative number of deaths from 2016 to 2013, which is 795 aid workers have been killed, approximately 33% of those also took place in road ambushes. And then one other thing we did, we tried to break down and look at the countries, the top 10 countries that we have, to see whether or not, in terms of the attack context, we could see any differences. In 7 of those top 10, it was attacks on the road, which were the most prevalent, and it ranged somewhere between 35 and 50%. And interestingly, in those 7 countries, which are Afghanistan, South Sudan, Pakistan, Sudan, DRC, CAR, and Yemen, they're also the countries where there are very long supply routes. And in our research, one of the things that came up was that the challenge particularly is on these long supply routes where there isn't any other option but to move goods and services and obviously staff moving as well. So now I guess the question is, and this is just what we came out of our research, and certainly Michael, in his discussion, will talk a lot more about the practical experience that his organisation and other organisations have experienced. The question is, why is it happening? And the first answer, might seem, really trite and obvious, but it's worth mentioning that frequent travel by humanitarian workers is essential to their work, whether they're commuting to the office every day or to far-flung project sites, whether they're trying to conduct an assessment or to reach out to community, to the communities they serve. Most aid workers spend some part of nearly every day on the road. And second, for the most part, aid workers are more vulnerable on the open road. They're outside the sort of protected gates of and the walls of their compounds or their offices. Arguably, it's easier to attack on the road in a walled compound, and it takes only light weaponry. It doesn't take a lot of manpower. Third, as one of our interviews noted, roads represent sort of massive real estate. It's impossible for most governments, much less ones that are undergoing significant crisis and lack basic security sector capacity, to effectively police or to survey entire stretches of road. And then fourthly, and I think this is a point that Michael will explore a little more, and something that really came out in our research and we felt was quite important, and we're keen to sort of understand better how organizations were tackling this. We would say that over the last decade or so, organizations have worked very hard to build acceptance, that is to sort of build a good rapport within the communities that they're working and they're serving in. But once they leave and travel, and especially on long routes, they don't necessarily hold that relationship, particularly with communities they're passing through. And those communities don't know who they are, they don't know the work they're doing, and they don't necessarily know to pass them information even if they have it. So on to the next slide. So what are agencies doing to mitigate the risks of being attacked on the road? Again, Michael will give you his perspective on this, and this is a summary of some of the issues that came up for us in the research and our findings. I guess the first point is that road security in high-risk setting requires a lot of advanced preparation. It requires substantial logistics capacity, programming flexibility, a lot of adaptation, and potentially increased resources as well. And planning is also very time-consuming, and it can result in a decision not to move, meaning that the whole entire process of assessment and its related logistics has to start again. So what I've grouped together is some of the key issues. What we saw agencies investing a lot in is increased surveillance on the road, designing their programs flexibly so that the programs could cope with staff not necessarily being there on a regular basis. Adaptation is huge, and that can mean a lot of different things, and it can change in the context that you're working with, and it's very context-driven. So in some contexts, lowering the profile and having a very, very local approach to operating might be the best way to go. For other contexts, and there is one in particular where it seemed quite universal, that hardening the target was the only option that agencies felt they had, short of not operating in that environment. Some of the tried and true methods are still being utilized and are still considered important, whether that be traveling in a two-car convoy or in a larger convoy, alternating routes and times of movement, not just on a weekly basis, but on a daily or even a sort of, hourly basis. And of course, flying rather than driving, if it's affordable and if it's maintainable over the longer term. Interestingly, with technology, we thought it potentially was, increasingly going to provide a solution. But as I'll talk about in the next slide, sometimes the GPS aspect isn't necessarily going to be useful. One, it isn't necessarily anything but it's not a preventative measure. So it only really allows for live tracking once the vehicle has been taken and potentially the staff as well. Secondly, the devices are often met with suspicion, and so a lot of agencies shun the use of technology in high-risk environments because it may be considered a worse thing to have on their person if they adopted a road check by militants or others. And then lastly, we found that there's inevitably a lot of outsourcing. Now, outsourcing would occur in a non-high-risk environment as well, but particularly using private trucking companies to move goods and a sort of essentially pushing the security and the financial risk to them has also been increasingly practiced. So this is the last slide that I have, and it's really just to say we tried to think through with the research team as well as the interviewees that we have about how we can make road travel safer. And there are just 4 things that I would point to here before handing over to Michael. Firstly, more thinking about what we're calling a sort of kinetic acceptance strategy. So how to extend the community agreements that organizations have and how to build rapport with communities that aren't necessarily within the operation. So we would argue that for the most part, a lot of acceptance building has been done at a very localized level, which has been hugely important to maintain access. But maybe we need to think more about the basis of acceptance when you're in transit. And then secondly, some interesting trade-offs when it comes to SOPs and addressing policies in organizations. In order to make road travel safety, it requires a dual focus on the safety of staff and assets and on the security of staff and assets. They're interrelated. And in the course of the research, a number of organizations pointed out that, of course, some safety incidents lead to security concerns. For example, if an aid agency hits a vehicle, an aid agency vehicle hits a child, which can lead to hostility from a family or a wider community and can result in violence. The second trade-off, or the second issue which is a concern, is that in certain contexts, maintaining a low profile might mean utilizing local vehicles, it might mean not wearing seatbelts, it might mean not having radios and other comms equipment. And that's a really important security strategy that an organization might take. But it's about a lot of basic safety rules that an organization also has in place. And we found that in our interviews, a lot of the time that organizations were aware that there was a level of inconsistency in what was happening in their policies. The third issue is just like today's, which is a really important dialogue, increasing the dialogue on, and sort of a collective dialogue amongst agency on good practice. Amongst the range of issues that we've looked over the last 10 years and the research that we've done, this is one that actually we couldn't point to any documentation where there had been a collective effort to think about these issues and to develop good practice around to them. And then lastly, to encourage donors to potentially support innovation in mobile security strategies and to encourage their understanding of the data and the issues that organizations face. So I'll leave it there and I'll pass over to Michael and he'll give you a very pragmatic, I'm sure, and practical understanding of the work that they're doing. Thank you for the opportunity to share with you our research.
Thank you very much, Adele, for that presentation. I'm sure that will be generating lots of questions as we go forward with today's presentation. And just a reminder to folks, when you submit your question, please submit it through the chat function and send to all panelists, and we'll be sure to feed your questions to Adele and to Michael. With that, let's turn over to Michael. Michael, the floor is yours.
And,
Michael, I believe you're still on mute.
Thank you, George.
Great.
And Anna and Adele for your presentation. I'm going to take a look at some of the mitigation strategies as Adele referenced and how this challenging environment and the information we're getting from the analysis of incidents provides an opportunity for us to adapt and move forward, but it is nevertheless a challenge. The key here for us in dealing with looking at options is being true to our humanitarian principles of humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and operational independence. And as far as looking at various approaches, whether it's based on an acceptance approach, a protection approach, or a deterrent approach, in the face of these challenges, we need to be more attentive to our principles and not cast them aside in order to meet our operational objectives. There are times when we have to walk a pretty thin line here, but I'm putting forth that maintaining these principles is key to long-term presence and access to vulnerable populations. Everybody's familiar with this acceptance, protection, and deterrence triangle. It is a static model no more. It doesn't represent anything but just trying to see how these three approaches may interact. And I'm going to just take a little time. I don't know for all of our participants whether they are familiar with this lexicon, and just give you a very quick update on acceptance. Is a means of reducing or removing threats by gaining consent from beneficiaries indeed, but also local authorities, armed actors, stakeholders, in order to access populations and implement programs. Gaining this acceptance is directly related to the positive local perceptions of an organization's mission, activities, and the personnel and their behavior. This acceptance approach is consistent with a relationship-driven approach to development and humanitarian response, so it dovetails nicely with programmatic approaches under those two responses. It is, in fact, a cornerstone of effective security management in both the development and humanitarian context, but it is not a panacea. And we do know that we also, in the field, apply certain protection measures which focus on vulnerability and trying to limit exposure to various kinds of threats. So the protection approach deals oftentimes with the impact of threats rather than the cause of threats. And this includes operational policies and procedures, staff awareness and development, equipment such as communication devices, reliable vehicles, which we will go into some detail with, and collaboration with other actors in the field. And then the third aspect is deterrence, oftentimes difficult for us to get our heads around because it flies in the face sometimes of our core principles, but it is effective at times in preventing an incident from occurring by posing a counter threat to perpetrators. It has significant limits for humanitarian agencies, as I mentioned, largely because it flies in the face of some of our core principles. And yet, we have to make some trade-offs. Adele referenced some of the trade-offs between safety and security, but I think we also have to keep in mind that there may be trade-offs into the extent to which we're going to push our humanitarian principles, and it's a hard judgment call, and sometimes it's a bit of a dilemma. But key elements of this could be suspension or withdrawal of activities, economic sanctions, the use of armed protection, or the use of military action, not necessarily by any of our organizations, but in the context of state and non-state actors. So if we look at the analysis provided that Adele summarized, we're looking at bodily assaults, explosives and heavy artillery, kidnapping, shooting, and carjackings, which are another part of the shooting piece. These are the dominant types of incidents that affect our operations in the field, and it's important, and I think I need to reassert this, is that we only get this information when people report incidents. And I would advise and encourage all of those participants here that in your respective organization to engage in good incident reporting that is sound and delivers the information that we need in order for Adele and her colleagues to analyze and give us the feedback that we need to adjust our strategies and do a better job at fine-tuning our approaches to ensure access to vulnerable populations and deliver effective programs. As we see from the earlier presentations, 42.5% of attacks against aid workers took place on the road. So the question is, well, what can we do about this? Some of the key special activities of stakeholder analysis, and I want to say a little bit more about this, is because if we limit stakeholders only to community members, then we're not reaching that kinetic level that Adele mentioned. Stakeholders include the communities, yes, and beneficiaries, but it also includes the armed actors themselves and those that can do us harm or cause us to lose access to vulnerable populations. And I must say that I just lost my screen here, George.
Sorry, Michael, we're trying to get that back up right now.
Okay.
If you want, maybe just continue with that point.
Yeah,
we'll get
okay.
So the idea
is that, yeah, to better understand who the actors are in the field and what their motivations are, and also what their modes of operation, then the better we can adapt. If we look at abduction, for instance, you know, in the mid-2000s, there was a spate of abductions in Haiti. And the analysis of those abductions led us to the understanding that it was largely Haitians back that were being victimized, and that no matter what amount the perpetrators were asking, they usually took a much smaller amount, and the things were usually resolved within 72 hours. And so as long as somebody was in that situation, if they stayed calm and abided by the instructions of their abductors, their chances of success were quite high. If you look at what was happening in Iraq at the same time, especially for Westerners, but not exclusively, there was a whole different dynamic around the way abducted people were treated, and the success rate or the survival rate was something around 50%. And so under those two circumstances, how one chooses to survive will be directly related to the understanding of the motive and means of operation of the various stakeholders. Let me pause here for a second and remind people to mute their lines. There's a little bit of interference coming through. I've already mentioned incident reporting and why it's important. It's important first and foremost for us to understand what's happening on the ground and for us to someone on the line really needs to, their line here. I think it might be coming from Sierra Leone because it's in Creole, so please mute your line.
Sorry about that, Michael.
No, that's okay. I'm just reminding people. So it's important for incident reporting, first of all, to understand the environment, the immediate environment, and then to move it up so we get collective data so we can do a much better job of looking at patterns and trends. The outcome of which is our sharing of information discussions such as this. The other thing is that, you know, the victims of these assaults require our support and can help us in designing better intervention strategies for supporting our colleagues, for doing better training or reallocating resources. So incident reporting is a key essential activity. Staff discipline is another piece here. To be frank, if we're engaging in programs and activities in these high-risk violent environments, we cannot be going in there half-heartedly or with this idea that we can fake it. We have to have very high levels of discipline and understand that the protocols that are in place are there for a reason. Next is understanding the general context and the dynamics and the history of the place so that we're not inadvertently shifting power dynamics or putting ourselves in a vulnerable position by virtue of not clearly understanding what is happening. This is true in a context where you've got a history of conflict, where you might have ethnic issues that will affect how we do staffing, how we do our program design. So understanding the context in addition to the stakeholders in the area are absolute prerequisites to designing an effective approach to safety and security management. Increased information sharing and coordination with other NGOs, both for sharing information, understanding the relative needs of each other, and knowing that how some organizations choose to address the challenges they face may very well impact your organization or limit or accentuate the options you have in front of you. And again, these are just basic prerequisites, and without all of these, success in applying some of the subsequent recommendations may be even more challenging. So I want to take a look at this through two different lenses. One is the acceptance, protection, deterrence approach. So you'll see that the green print is largely acceptance approach, blue is protection, and red is deterrence. Excuse me. The other thing is looking through the lens of basic risk mitigation, trying to reduce the likelihood that an attack will occur, and the other side is reducing the impact should the attack occur. So the first one on the left-hand side, top of the column, is consult drivers on routes and areas to avoid and common incident locations. It's fairly standard procedure for us to call ahead to a destination and get feedback from the people at the destination about their experience about any incidents on the road in the last 24 hours or whatever that acceptable time period is. But it also behooves us to go to the local transport park and have our drivers consult with private sector drivers who are applying the roads with regularity to understand what they're encountering on the road, whether it's weather conditions, whether it's demonstrations, whether it's roadblocks, whether it's checkpoints, whether it's attacks. And let us not just close ourselves off to NGO type of attacks. I mean, there are other people in the environment who have information that we can use. And by virtue of that, we can do better trip planning, adapt our routes, train our staff, decide whether we're going to a convoy or not. All of this is based on getting more and more information and goes directly to the heart of context analysis. Another way of reducing the likelihood is by receiving information from local sources on ground conditions and possible threats. And this is where your stakeholder analysis pays big dividends. By understanding who are the people along the lines, to not limit your interactions only with the people at the destination point, which it may be your community or beneficiaries, but understanding what is along your route, whether there are other NGO offices, government offices, other places and stakeholders who might give you valuable information, and taking the time, if you know you're going to be applying these routes over time, to have these stop-in points to, buy or procure things, or to just spend a little bit of time to engage people to find out how they're working and developing these kinds of relationships. It also helps, if an event does occur, to identify safe havens where you might retreat to receive assistance or protection. The third piece here on reducing the likelihood is the use of branding. If one is satisfied that the organization has reached a high level of acceptance, then the use of branded vehicles acts as a way of announcing your presence and declaring for those stakeholders with whom you've had acceptance that you are in the area. The trade-off here is that if NGOs are being targeted and your NGO hasn't distinguished itself above and beyond other NGOs, then you may have to go to a more low-profile, unmarked approach. And this is something that can only be determined by an analysis of ground realities. Obviously, route planning, traveling in convoys are choices that can be made to try to reduce the likelihood by linking up with other NGOs or putting a multiple vehicle convoy together. Not too large as to attract too much attention, but a 2 or 3 vehicle movement to allow support, spacing, and options, and there's frankly more eyes on the road for doing a basic passive surveillance of things that are happening around. Obviously, Ricky, I don't know if the analysis proves this out, but a lot of vulnerability increases after dark for a lot of reasons, both from a security and from a safety perspective. So reducing night travel is a highly recommended process. And using air as an alternative when you can, obviously it's going to be a restriction if you're hauling large quantities of procured goods. And it's also much more expensive. Ultimately, if we want to take a deterrent approach, there's the use of armed escorts. These can be provided by the government. These could be provided by the UN. They could be contracted privately. Understanding what the need is, what the trade-offs are, and having a formalized system for determining when the use of armed escorts is appropriate and not appropriate, and what the essential trade-offs are. Because a one-time use of armed escorts could have a deleterious effect on long-term acceptance and access to populations. Ultimately, if the situation becomes too insecure, it becomes difficult to maintain operations, and organizations may be forced to suspend operations or to withdraw from an area. And one other way of, instead of using armed escorts, is to rely on local state and non-state actors to do armed patrols of the area and create a more secure ambiance to an area. This becomes much more of an issue of resources, of the number of personnel available, the kinds of logistic support they have to patrol a particularly dangerous road, for instance, either by having static checkpoints or doing patrols up and down, may be a better option for NGOs than direct armed escorts. Going to the reducing the impact side, again, from an acceptance perspective, training our drivers in negotiation techniques, better surveillance understanding, how to gain acceptance through their behavior and interactions with people is a useful and necessary skill set for gaining acceptance and perhaps mitigating a potential targeted attack. Getting local leaders involved so that they can inform us and guide us on our activities and behaviors, and ensuring that all drivers and passengers can clearly articulate the vision and principles under which we're operating to reinforce the humanitarian perspective if confronted at a hostile checkpoint or by even a criminal element to use a situation. It's useful to have 2 forms of communication equipment in order to communicate in advance or behind, or to call for help if necessary. In the event of injury, having good trauma first aid kits and trained personnel to help to deal with any injuries is useful and necessary when operating in violent environments where explosives and weaponry are common. Training your drivers in evasive and defensive training skills, the use of armored vehicles, GPS tracking and other technologies. And Adele gave a caveat to this. Some of these things can be pretty discreet and passive, and some do have panic alarms attached to them, which might shorten the time of response capacity and maybe be the difference between your staff being abducted or not. We can transfer the risk a little bit by outsourcing the movement of goods and services, and then finally, again, by suspending activities in high-threat areas if necessary. Now, the point to make here is that these are combined strategies. One alone is not going to work, and it's incumbent upon us, based on our analysis and our understanding of the environment, to choose the right combination and be willing to adapt as the situation changes. So in summary, a thorough understanding of the context, stakeholders, and types of incidents is a key to formulating the appropriate mix of strategies. An effective acceptance approach increases information flow about changing conditions, intent of actors, and road conditions, though it's not a panacea. And joint strategies with other NGOs, either by use of convoys, information sharing, or coordinating movements, can help reduce risk. I'll stop there and turn it back over to George and the facilitators, because I'm sure you guys have lots of questions. Thank you so much.
Michael, thank you very much. Very much appreciate that presentation. And yes, we have a good queue of questions lined up. So let me just dive in. But before I do, a reminder, if you have a question, please send it to all panelists in your chat box in the lower right portion of your screen. The first question I think really is best addressed to Adele, and that question comes from Julia Brooks. The question is, the aid worker security database is missing data on gender, for instance, the sex of the person or the portfolio of issues on which they work, for over half of the victims of violence. How does gender affect the security of humanitarian staff? Adele?
Yeah, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, you sound good.
Great, okay. So thank you, Julia, for that question. It's a really important one. In fact, we do track the sex of the victim. So where that information is provided, we take that information on. The problem is it's often not provided, and we can't just assume one or other, so we haven't actually put it up on the online database, but it is information that we track as part of the data collection, and we're increasingly trying to encourage agencies to disaggregate at that level, because like you, we see it as very important. The question on sort of the relative, vulnerability of women over men or men over women in the field and the related, jobs that they do is a really important one as well. But just to backtrack on that, in order to get that information, what we need to have is disaggregated data of the entire aid worker population. So we need to know how many men are in the field and how many women are in the field, and we need to then be able to have disaggregated victim data in order to then begin to compare rates of violence against men and women, and certainly a detailed level of analysis then, over whether or not the types of jobs they do increase that vulnerability or not. It's information we would love to get, and we continue in our engagement with aid agencies to encourage more information reporting on that basis. Michael might have some thoughts on how effective it is within SAVE, but certainly it's the reporting at the moment that isn't sufficient enough for us to be able to be confident with any analysis that we would do with that data. Over to Michael, if you had any other comments on that.
Only to say that, to reiterate your point, the data is only as good as the data that's being submitted, and if we're not disaggregating by gender for victimology in our incident reporting, then it's going to be hard to derive that from any kind of analysis. And then, of course, there's the denominator issue of understanding what's the relative percentage and disposition of men and women field workers. No, it's a challenge, and we have control of one piece of the equation, which is the disaggregation in our incident reporting, but there's the bigger challenge of finding out the gender distribution of field workers.
Right. And sorry, just a follow-up point to that, just so Julia, you're aware, in 2013, there were 2 incidents of violent sexual assault that were reported to AWSD. So of the 251 incidents, we had 2 incidents reported. I suspect that's lower than the reality, but reporting that kind of information is also difficult and sensitive.
Great. Thank you both for those responses. We now have sort of a 2-part question from Gianluigi. And the first part of the question is probably best for Adele, and that is, who are the main perpetrators of the attacks in the top 5 countries? Are they mainly or only non-state actors, such as bandits and armed groups? So that question for Adele. And then the second part of that question for Michael, or really either speaker, is the increase in attacks a consequence of the general deterioration of security in a given area, for instance, a failed state, or do you believe aid workers represent a special target? So first, Adele, on the question of the top 5 countries, who are the main perpetrators?
Yeah, thank you for that question. We don't systematically capture that information because, you know, often the reality is that aid workers sometimes don't know who perpetrated the incident, or certainly don't know how they're associated. But where we have it, you know, where it's provided, we do collect it. I would say it's mixed. I don't think it's only non-state actors, and particularly in a country where the government is party to the conflict, we definitely have incidents of both. Maybe it's weighted in some countries more to NSAs, but I wouldn't say it's the majority that way. I'll let Michael pick up the latter part of the question, and I can sort of weigh in if useful.
So the latter part of the question was, is it a matter of the general security occurring because it's a failed state, or is it because aid agencies represent a soft target? I think the real answer is probably a combination of both. Let's focus on each one. Clearly, if we're going into a conflict environment, any organization needs to understand what the real risks are. So your security risk assessment should be putting in place what are the core threats and how these are likely to impact your organization. And then through this analysis, try to come up with mitigation strategies that are going to allow you to do your programming and access vulnerable populations while at the same time mitigating the risk for your staff. And part of that is understanding how your organization, your individual staff, are likely to be viewed by the various actors in the field, and whether this will engender them to target you or not. Sometimes with the criminal element, it's mostly about property. And so, you know, your vehicle selection, how you decide to move valuable goods across great distances are core decisions that you have to make by understanding what the criminal motives are and their means of operation. In the case of, I remember in Darfur for a long time, 4-wheel drive NGO vehicles were being persistently targeted, largely by non-state actors, but also by state actors. And for the non-state actors, they wanted to convert these 4-wheel drive vehicles into their own technicals or military vehicles. And by changing the type of vehicle or contracting with local providers, we reduced the amount of carjacking quite significantly by just getting off the mark, as it were, by not presenting ourselves with the desirable commodity that these bandits were desiring. That won't work in every case, but in this case it tended to reduce the number of incidences. The other side of this is how do we behave and how do we treat the local population and how do we deliver programs. And these things can change the motivation with regard to whether we're targeted or not. It's not going to resolve everything, because sometimes even if we succeed, if you have a perpetrator who is vested in instability and our success creates stability, then our success works against the interests of the perpetrator, and it may engender being targeted in order to meet whatever their objectives are. So there's both sides of this coin, and we need to do proper analysis to understand how we're going to navigate through a very treacherous environment with actors who are not averse to using violence.
Great. Thank you very much for that, Michael. One of the questions just came in is a nice, easy one, so I'll handle it, and that is, will copies of the PowerPoints being used in today's presentation be made available afterwards? And the answer is yes. So within 48 hours on Disaster Ready, you can find both a recording, audio recording of the webinar itself, but in addition, copies of the presentations from our two panelists. So having said that, let me get to the next question. Could you speak a bit more about the differential level of threat faced by national staff versus international staff? What's behind the difference besides just the relatively larger number of national staff members out there? So I think you both might want to comment on this, but Adele, why don't we start with you, and then we'll go to Michael.
Yeah, sure. So as I said, for the analysis that we've done, the vast majority of the victims are national, and that actually equates, of course, to the number in the field. In fact, though, when you actually look at it on a relative scale, internationals are at 13%. More likely, to be the victims, because there's normally, for the most part, of organizations probably have a much slimmer number of their percentage of their organization in the field. It's probably more like, as we understand it, somewhere between 7 and 8%. So despite the fact that the majority of victims in absolute terms are national staff, it's the internationals who, on a relative rate, are more exposed. And that we attribute particularly to some quite clear targeting in some contexts, and in others, it's a place of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. But there are certainly, in particular countries where there is potentially an anti-Western agenda operating, there are targeted attacks against aid workers that are politically motivated in order to bring greater, lighter attention to the work of that militant group or any other particular issue.
I'll take a little bit of a different angle on that. Since we're talking about security incidents on the road, I'd say 99% of the drivers are national staff. So you're going to get a skew toward national staff anyway, just because our drivers are national staff for the most part. I would also say that for certain crimes or certain incidents, abduction, let's say, foreign personnel represent a higher value target in the eyes of some of the perpetrators, either for cash or for political impact. So I think if you look at it from an abduction perspective, but for the other things like carjackings or crossfires or other roadside attacks, it's usually the symbol or the vehicle itself that becomes the target, and who's in the vehicle becomes secondary. This is not based on any analysis per se, but just on experience and looking at how within our own organization and my discussions with my colleagues in other organizations, that there's a differential here. And I think to really answer this, we have to break it down by the types of incidents that we're talking about. Clearly, with the preponderance of national staff, especially in high-risk environments or reducing exposure of international staff because of the potential that they may be high-value targets, puts our strategies further and further and puts our national staff at greater risk. And it behooves us to focus on this and make sure, I think in last year's study that Adele put out, there was a critique that we do not invest in the development and capacity building and training of our national staff to the level of the exposure that they feel. And I think we should not lose sight of that in the course of our discussions today.
Michael and Adele, thank you. Very, very good questions, both. Here's one that you both may be interested in taking a whack at. This is a tough one. The question comes from Peter Roberts, and he asks, I'm interested to ask the panelists about considerations and factors relative to going low profile to high profile with their vehicle movements. Now, Michael, you touched on this a bit earlier, but the specific question he gets onto is his particular case is in Afghanistan. He says, we knew we had good acceptance from local non-state armed actors, but we were worried about the international non-state actors operating in that area. And so he's asking for both of your views on how to deal with that, frankly, toughest of the tough armed actors that you sometimes run into. Michael, do you want to start?
Well, again, this is going to be a judgment call, and part of it would be to determine what is the likelihood of these international armed non-state actors' presence and their ability to exercise their prerogative over the interests of the local non-state actors. That would be the first thing. And so in the case of Afghanistan, if you're looking at the local Taliban commander that you've developed some kind of rapport with and negotiated access, and you have confidence in their chain of command, and therefore you're determined you're going to go in with explicit branding so they understand who you are, then the question is, if you're proximate to a border and there's this incursion from a larger Taliban-affiliated organization, are they likely to override this acceptance that you've gotten from the local Taliban commander? I mean, that's the question, and your analysis needs to give you a bit of an insight into that. The other thing is, if you're going to go low profile, is there a way to go low profile and still let your negotiated acceptance with the local Taliban commanders be still in effect, so that they recognize that you're going low profile but still understand who you are, but not so explicitly that you're coming in with flags that you might attract the attention of the non-state, not the outsider non-state actors. There's never going to be a clear answer because there's too many variables to consider.
Thanks, Michael. Adele, any interest in that one or no?
Yeah, no, I mean, I would just underscore what Michael said. It's situational analysis, and security is local entirely, and that decision making is really difficult. For sure, in our research, we definitely saw both approaches by some organizations being undertaken in the same country, but it more related to the type of work that they were trying to undertake, rather than sort of an agency-wide decision. It was particularly about who they were moving and what they were moving them for. But I do think it's a difficult one and has to be, very much contextually driven.
I will say, if I might just add, that in Afghanistan, we've had 2 incidences where we chose to go low profile. I mean, there were more incidences where we've gone low profile, but 2 incidents occurred because of a misidentification of our staff because we were so low profile. So, it's a trade-off. And in both cases, fortunately, we were able to mitigate, but we were victimized by these attacks because people didn't know who we were and misinterpreted our presence because we were not branded. So there's a trade-off that also needs to be considered here.
Yeah.
Very interesting, very interesting. And again, as you said, Michael and Adele, really underscores local contextualization. And on that point, our next question comes from Gihan Hassanin, and he asks, do you think specialized NGO safety coordination bodies, such as INSSA, are improving the sharing of information among NGOs and providing better NGO understanding of the local context? Michael, maybe we'll start with you on that one.
Oh, I would like to think so. I know that in areas where there's these NGO coordinating bodies have matured, that there is a much better understanding among the member NGOs, both local NGOs, international NGOs, of context, because they're sharing information, they're encouraging each other to share incidents, and it creates a more robust dialogue for understanding the context and what others are doing. So it helps with that level of coordination. I think these coordinating bodies are only as good as the input that people bring to the table. And my experience has been in places like Afghanistan, in Yemen, in West Bank and Gaza, in Kenya, and other places where these NGO bodies are actually doing quite a good job. And in South Sudan and Somalia, there's places. And I think, whether it's an INSO-driven process or not is not the point. I think that the basic coordination and working through the Saving Lives Together with our UN colleagues are definitely giving us advantages in context and sharing experiences.
And from my side, I would, 100% agree with Michael, and I would probably just add one other point, which is that in order to be really effective, I think these safety coordination bodies and information sharing bodies really have to reach out and work with the local NGO providers as well. They're often, well, at least from our data, they're the ones that experience the vast majority in terms of organization type of incidents. And so if we don't understand their experiences, then we don't definitely have the full picture. And I know in the past that some coordination bodies have been better at reaching out and including those local organizations in their ongoing dialogue and assisting their capacities to provide that reporting than others. But a more uniform approach to that would really benefit the NGO community across the board.
Great, thank you both for those answers. And I see that we're just about at the 1 hour mark because we started a few minutes late. So let me throw one more question out there and then we'll wrap up. The last question is, for roadside attacks and ambushes, was it possible or is it possible to disaggregate what % were ostensibly intended for aid workers versus security forces, whether they're police or military? And I think Iraq and Afghanistan certainly are prime context for this question. So Adele, maybe we'll start with you and then go to Michael. Any thoughts on that in terms of intention?
Yeah, motive, as we describe it, is the thorniest of all of the issues that we look at in terms of confidence that we have of the data that's provided, and that reflects the confidence that aid organizations have of that data. I guess it's sort of a bit of a dual question. It's about who the perpetrators were and then what their motive was. I think we have better data on who the perpetrators are, and it's harder to glean motive. But I guess I could say watch this space. Our next aid worker security database report that will be released next year, we are going to try to unpack as best we can motive. And we look at motive along 3 lines, whether it's political, whether it's economic, which is sort of a criminal intent, or whether it's incidental. And I guess the question that the participant is making is, how much do we know about the incidental nature of that? We're really hoping we can glean some more light on that in the next report. And that's probably all I should say at this stage with the data that we have.
I think that to determine this, we have to look back at some of the other trends. If you have a strip of road where you've got commercial vehicles being targeted, and then you're subsequently targeted on that same road, you might infer that it's part of more of a criminal element. If the distinction is between whether you're being mistaken for government personnel or for military personnel, I think the main thing is to understand what's the differentiation in your profile when you're traveling on the road. In the cases I alluded to in Afghanistan, in both cases we were misidentified as being in government vehicles because the white Land Cruiser with no markings looked just like government vehicles. So if you're going to go low profile, understand that low profile may be inadvertently creating so you might go low profile but be distinguishable from other actors on the field, so you're not misidentified based on that misidentification. Clearly, I think if I recall from the Iraq situation, there was at some point a clear intention by some of the armed actors to move in white Land Cruisers in order to camouflage their activities under the guise of humanitarian workers, and therefore created, in a way, of intentional confusion on the ground. In that case, it's probably likely that some attacks on NGOs were done with the perception that they were not, in fact, NGOs, but were other actors to the conflict.
Excellent points. Excellent points. I think that's a great place for us to wrap up here. We've just hit the 1 hour mark. So let me, in wrapping up, let me just say that I really want to thank the presenters and all of the attendees for their supreme patience in dealing with some of our background noise issues during today's webinar. Apologies, I think we had a bug or a glitch in our system, but thank you all for hanging in there. I think we were really fortunate to have such excellent presentations from both Adele and from Michael. And as previously mentioned, copies of their PowerPoints, along with a recording of this webinar, will be available within 48 hours on disasterready.org for those who are interested. Before we part, let me just put in a quick plug for our next webinar. Our next webinar will be taking place later this month on the 18th of November with Lynn Kripe of the Contera Group addressing managing critical incidents. And just to be clear, critical incidents in this context refer to incidents within your own staff team, within your own operations. So not necessarily amongst the folks you're in the field trying to assist, but within your own team and how best to deal with those when they unfortunately arise. So we hope to see you at that webinar. But in closing, again, a huge thanks to both Adele and to Michael. Thank you all for attending today. We wish you a good rest of the day, and we look forward to seeing you at a future webinar. Thanks very much, everyone.